And we're live. I'm here with LB. LB, how you doing?
Doing good, Caleb. Thanks for having me. I think we'll find out at the end of this episode.
This will be a fun one. Happy to have you on again. I've been listening to your series with Andrew on the Evan Crowned him.
Yep.
And I picked up the book myself and trying to get through it, read it myself now. It's a good book. I'm really enjoying it.
It's a very interesting book for me to read. Both as like somebody who was raised Catholic, struggles with the Catholic faith, but also somebody who just what I've really enjoyed about the series is just getting into a text and having that and having all the things click as somebody walks you through an argument. I was very, as I'm wont to be, but I was very skeptical at the beginning of it. And whereas now closer, 7 chapters in or so, I kind of actually see a lot of the logic and find out that it actually coheres to a lot of the stuff that a lot of the things that I was kind of ruminating on myself, which is always interesting for people who take intellectual pursuits seriously. And it's certainly something that I always return to, which is as unique as you might think you are, somebody's probably been here before. Somebody at some point in human history has probably thought a little bit along the lines that you've thought. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I think that's kind of part of what makes us human in a very real way. But yeah, and I think that ties a little bit to our conversation tonight.
Oh yeah, there's definitely something freeing, I think, about that when you realize there's really no new ideas under the sun. This new formulations of ideas, sort of, or new ways of saying old ideas, and you can kind of okay. If I start thinking of something, I have to find a way to describe it to find out who else thought this, and I can read where they went from here. Like when I first found out about Erich von Knut-Leden, like a Catholic Austrian who was like a monarchist and a admitted Thomist. I'm like, okay, this guy called himself all the same thing I call myself. Let's see what he thought. I'm like, I think the same things. He just thinks more and better, and being able to build from where he left off. It's kind of there's a freeing in the finding the same people, finding people who think what you think like you think, and maybe just go from where they left off. They move the legwork. There's a bit of a freedom in there. I think that's super helpful. But to get to the point of this, excuse me, there's a lot of libertarians who don't seem to know philosophy, or they conflate political theory and economics with philosophy. I've noticed it more as I'm getting more and more into philosophy, that when a libertarian says something, there's a lot of presuppositions that they are just kind of building. It is accepting the norm and building off of, and then not ever defending or elaborating or refuse to talk about. Like a lot of the things like IP, for example. IP doesn't exist. Well, they're kind of materialistic in their view. It's a more materialism, where IP doesn't physically exist because property is physical, therefore IP doesn't exist, and they build their IP views on that instead of, I think, stronger arguments, because they have a very materialistic way of thinking. Have you noticed this too, or am I just the only guy to notice this?
Well, I think you touched upon a number of things, and I think in general, people don't have, most people aren't super interested in philosophy. With libertarians, it gets interesting because kind of your point, to the degree to which people conflate political theory with political philosophy per se, and the field of economics with political philosophy or philosophy. And like there's kind of there are well-intentioned reasons for it, right? Like, for example, if a very common upper graduate degree is a PPE, like a philosophy of politics and economics. So in fact, in that they're studied in higher education, they are largely correlated with each other. What you also said in that is that with people who focus solely on economics rely on a lot of presuppositions. And those presuppositions are precisely the realm of what many people, I think, today would call philosophy. And certainly this is where it's okay, is philosophy sorry, this is the thing you do in philosophy, though, right? What is philosophy? Is philosophy a collection of books? Is philosophy the way you're supposed to live your life? Is philosophy the exploration of ideas, kind of, and like and like the just examining every single possible angle or understanding like that an idea can have. And by breaking down those differences and understandings, you can try to like build a logical, rational argument for something that you believe in. So I think so those presuppositions I personally find a little more interesting. For example, right, I talk about practicing skepticism on my show, which comes from just I've always been very interested in epistemology and how society, or and you know, I guess, and how societies in particular like use words to say different things. And so again, there's a large crossover with economics, and so I've studied plenty of economics as well. But the question there, I think the question really is just a matter of scope. And as long as you limit, and as long as you recognize the limits of your scope, you know you're going to use a tool better, a tool like economics.
Absolutely. No, it's excuse me. Let's see, how do I put this? The answer to Das's question here about what is philosophy, how do you define philosophy? It's difficult to, I think, define, because I think there's people like Peter Kreeft to define philosophy as just a love of wisdom, which I like that, but it's kind of short and sweet and doesn't really get to a point of like, you know, by definition, anyone who loves wisdom is a philosopher. You know, I think there needs to be a more stringent definition, but I don't really have a good one.
No, it's the study of how was I taught? So, you know, what you're taught is, like you're very lover of wisdom, lover of truth. I mean, this is like the beginning point of all philosophy is getting definitions correctly. And that's, I mean, that's why I tried to address that there are multiple ways in which people will use something like philosophy, and to a certain degree, that's okay. Yeah. And in fact, in a very real way, right? Like I operate kind of against that tendency to separate everything out into neat little boxes as far as like modern academia is concerned, right? I tend to take a more holistic approach to my quest for knowledge, you might say. Right. So it's not about being super specialized and hyper specialized. I'm far more on the generalist side of things. Just for everybody to understand. But to the point is, when you're awarded a higher, like this is very base level stuff, right? But like if you're awarded a PhD, that's a doctorate of philosophy. So everybody is a philosopher of a kind, even if you're a historian, right? So it's like, is philosophy just Plato and Aristotle and the people today who say they're philosophers, or is philosophy like what everybody does? I look at it as an examination of truth, we might say. I look at it as, I view philosophy as the process, the means by which we come to knowledge, and I look at the repository of the various philosophers as stepping stones on a path to somewhere. You know, we might not exactly know, but it's maximizing human reason to examine the world around us. And at least in that, I was taught in part, you know, in the West, we trace it back to ancient Greece. Is part of it had to do with reconciling differing religious beliefs as well. And I think you can kind of see how that naturally flows if two cultures have different religious practices that are almost at odds, right? Because our gods are not the same as theirs, and yet they're met with success and we're met with success. How can we try to come to understand how this phenomena occurs, given that it goes against our frame of knowledge that we currently have established? So I think, the field of philosophy is about studying truth, broadly speaking, or at least that's what they would have said at one point in time.
It's get back to the topic of libertarian. There seems to be I would say a political ideology has to consist of political theory, philosophical presuppositions, and then art statements, along with a view of at least a somewhat view of economics. I would say you have to have what people ought to do, what kind of political, how your system would work, view of economics that can be incorporated into the political theory, and in the presuppositions you use to say why these things are good in a philosophical context. And a lot of libertarians, I think, only have the economics, political theory, and kind of even ignore art statements outside of the idea of like, well, people ought not be aggressed against, so people ought not be aggressors. And they kind of stop there. They don't ever take it any further to say people ought to be free. They say, well, people are free naturally, and then it's the outside scene to step in that will rob the freedom. People ought to be free, but it's to actually already have the freedom. I think there's a lot of baggage in their ideology that's not ever really discussed. Like they're all great libertarian thinkers who have gone into like the presuppositions or talk about how Austrian economics is either Kantian or scholastic. But I think it's kind of something that is breezed by a lot of people to get to like more forefront issues without understanding the actual base of things.
I think in part where I'm going to be philosophical about this, but it's who are we talking about when we say libertarians? And this is the point that I've tried to make in my own small little way, where I've talked specifically about like this subculture of libertarianism that I've been a part of for the better part of a decade. But it's reached a certain level of popularity to where the core ideas have kind of been, I don't know, forgotten, laid to the side. I was talking recently about how when I started studying, when the question of like political philosophy was brought up to me, or I started looking into these ideas, there was never the presupposition that this would become my entire identity. Right. Turns out I have a large interest in it. Politics is something that I've pursued, and like an interest in politics and the current events has been something I've pursued. But that came before I discovered anything vis-a-vis libertarianism. Right. And so I never had this thing of like, oh, well, what the political philosophy I find, that's the thing that's going to become a large part of my identity. Now, it certainly did for a good portion of time, right? As many people in my life would attest to, right? As you're kind of ingesting, and if you're somebody who ingests a lot of information, you're also going to like digest that information and then try to share it with people. It's one of the reasons why you're so interested in collecting information, is to actually share it with other people. This is to say, I think something, I'm a millennial, but like at the tail end of millennials. I was born in 1992, but I think there's something of a generational difference that occurred where suddenly it wasn't just about an academic pursuit. It was about a lifestyle. It was about a culture. It was about an attitude towards things. But to answer the question directly, there was always deontological arguments within libertarianism, right? There were arguments that took things for granted, and deontology is like a Kantian frame, right? So you could, and yes, Mises was very influenced by that. Of course he would have been, because that's what he would have read in college, and that would have been the style that he was comfortable writing with. But there's always been deontological or utilitarian or consequentialist arguments for things, right? You can actually look across most schools of thought, and you look and find out that people tend to have both of those kinds of arguments to justify those schools of thought in and of themselves, whether that be conservatism, whether that be progressivism, whether that be liberalism, to the extent that something like that still exists. And so you find it within libertarianism. My personal, the way I look at things is behavior or like your temperament manifesting through your behavior. And I think that's an element that people tend to gloss over as well. So again, I think, I do think that libertarianism answers a lot of modern types of political questions. Where I've become critical of it recently is that I think it requires a recalibration from where it was to where it is today. And I think a lot of people recognize that, and they're just recalibrating differently. So, that's kind of where you're actually getting into it. But I think, again, because you asked me on to talk about, why they don't have a broader base. And I think in part it's because economics is such a powerful tool. It's a really, really powerful tool for those proximate causes, because it helps answer, especially the Austrian school, because the Austrian school relies so much on philosophy, right? The idea of a science being logic-based is itself an exercise in philosophy. We were saying before we went on that, like, around the time of Marx and later Mises, the economists were really, and the progressive era, really, the economists were considered the new philosophers, right? Everybody gets issued a PhD, a doctorate in philosophy. So who are the people at the cutting edge? Well, economics for a while was considered that cutting edge because it was a new field. And that's what the Austrian school gives you. I think where people get mistaken, right, is when thinking that something like that can give you answers across all domains. And I do think that, and I think that's where I think that's apparent to people who have studied it, right? An expert in the Austrian school wouldn't say that this is going to tell you how to live your life. I mean, economics professors always make the joke about, I think, what's his name? I don't want to give him credit. It's Lucas Edelson. I can't remember his last name, but he's with the Mises Institute. I love his lectures. I always make sure to watch him, and he loves Star Trek, and that's part of the reason why. But he said he makes a joke like he wanted to study money instead of make money, right? So it's like, not to say that you can't earn a good living with the academic pursuit, but it's different than trying to like maximize profit for, for your lifestyle or something like that. And I think in the tension therein, you kind of start to see where if you take a strictly economic view for your entire life, you might run into a bad time. And you can tie that to ideas like materialism if you want, right? And in fact, part of it is because of its strict materialism, right? But you can get pretty far with materialism is the reality.
I think to answer your question you asked earlier about like what's libertarians and that kind of stuff, it's really this entire podcast is born out of two things. One, I got into a little again, preface Ace Arcus. I consider him a friend. He's been on the podcast. I like Ace. He's a friendly guy. We had a little disagreement, and I had loads of people from his following base, like 20,000 followers now, who all want to be like Ace, so they all will argue with you too, but none of them are worth arguing with. Mm-hmm. And so you see a flood of like these people who aren't smart, trying to be like someone who is admittedly decently smart, like Ace. And it's just kind of like, okay, what is this? What is happening? What is with this like large number of people who are all finding libertarianism and anarchism, whether through Ace, through Michael Malice, through Dave Smith, who are then coming into it. And the people who know the philosophy, really know like the presuppositions, know the stuff going on, aren't being paid attention to and it's understandable for a lot of the masses aren't going to like fully adopt the whole philosophy or do all the reading research. That's understandable. But there are ones who, how do I put this? There are a good number of people, I would say, who believe libertarianism is a political philosophy, and are not doing any of the actual deep dives or research into it. And I don't, which is, again, an understandable thing, but something I think it should be at least called out, and then so people can at leading see this, like, okay, well, I guess maybe I should do some reading for some actual philosophy,
The whole Twitter thing is, it's one of, so like I have a thing with my friends, and like if somebody's, because I'm a kind of and I complain too, and the start of something I started doing with myself is I realized I have a tendency to catastrophize, and I can really break down a situation really, really well, right? And my studying philosophy has probably helped that somewhat. But so I can really, really break things down well, and I can pick apart something and be like, these are all the things wrong with this process, or why this is why nothing ever gets done in such a company, blah blah blah. And I realized, and I would like call my coworker, and like we would both complain, blah blah blah. And I'd like to think this is something that other people share, and I'm not just crazy. So what I realized was, I was doing this, and I'm like, okay, well, let me try and flip this, and let me try and turn this into like a solution. So when I notice myself on this path, I'm like, I flip it, and if I can't come up with a solution, then when I talk to somebody, I have to preface what I'm saying and say, look, I'm just complaining, right? I'm just bitching. And I think as long as you understand that, like if I come to you and say, look, I just need to complain about something real quick, cool, we can have a conversation, and you're not expected to fix anything, and I'm not expected to solve anything either. And so how does this relate? Okay, so this relates to what we do on Twitter, where like we're really just kind of complaining, and Twitter rewards brashness, and it rewards dunking, and it rewards kind of like calling people out. And to be frank, it doesn't create a conducive environment for philosophical exchange. It's one of the reasons why I, as somebody who's responsible with the tool of philosophy, I treat Twitter like WWE. I'm not trying to pretend to be a philosopher on Twitter. I'm not even trying to pretend to be a philosopher on my show, right? Yeah. That's part of the story. I was trying to pull up Stanford. I've written about this at beenawake.com, but like I was trying to pull up Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, because that's kind of like considered like a mainstay source for like basic definitions. But I know part of their entry for philosophy or the philosopher again comes from this hesitancy towards like calling oneself the thing, right? So the logos, the truth, right? Logos, truth. Well, so the first guy who was studying this didn't want to call himself the truth, so he called himself a philosopher, a lover of the truth. The other people were the ones who said the truth. He was merely studying it, and so and so too. So you see that that's again that humility, really, when it's done properly, right? It's a humble thing. That's why everybody was pissed off at Socrates in Plato's Socrates, is that he just kind of like walked around and said, well, hey, people say you have the truth, do you? And then it turns out they didn't, right? It turns out, you can go through those sorts of things. But so sorry, I kind of got sidetracked. You were talking about the Twitter exchanges, but these Twitter exchanges are formulaic, and again, while entertaining at times, are also a really big mind suck. Because again, from a philosophical perspective, there's no actual exploration happening. There's debate. Now, debate is something very, very different, and debate serves a completely different purpose. And if you know your philosophy, you can get good at debate, but it's a matter of intention. So if my intention as somebody like Ace is to make sure that I always look smart in front of my followers, then that leads to certain incentive structure to where even in cases where an honest mistake happens, or in a case where like something is, where it's wrong, there's no judge, right? The judge is just the crowd. There's no referee. There's nobody calling balls and strikes. There's no formal structure to actually ascertain the validity of anybody's position. It's just what somebody thinks about. And in a political argument, the moral edge goes to the side you already agree with. So what you just get is a reinforcement mechanism as it relates to that. And that's part of the danger of to what you were kind of driving at, of mistaking political philosophy per se with philosophy as a whole. Because for most of philosophy, it isn't contentious. It's interesting. It's contentious on a different scale, right? It's really about, again, like that epistemic frame that we're trying to enter into. And so, I've been rambling.
That's fine. One of the reasons I wanted to this conversation is I listened to your podcast with is it Josiah? Was that his name? The really esoteric guy. I like him on Twitter, but he's very esoteric. And you mentioned I completely forgot about that poll I posted about the like most important branch of philosophy. I recently went back to that poll and I looked through it, and I'm still kind of not shocked at Essex one, but kind of like, really, Essex? I think it's the more and more I do polls, the more and more I realize my audience is not general. It's very niche and very specific, and I'm realizing that if I put up a poll saying most important single of the 20th century, and I put Mises on there next to but anyone else, they're all gonna go Mises. And it's and it's really the point of the poll. Really, I wanted to get people's take on why different branches have importance in philosophy as a whole. And it really did seem like the libertarians kind of went in there and all voted Essex because the most important thing to them is a ethical framework of how people should act amongst each other, and not anything like, to me, Essex is like the end point. You view metaphysics and epistemology to determine, okay, is this Essex true, and how is this true? And they kind of like just skip that to the end of the Essex side of things. See what I'm saying?
When I do, I enjoy conversations like this. I have them on my show sometimes. But when I do my solo show, my concern is not whether my audience has the same epistemology as me or the same metaphysical beliefs. My concern is putting on a good show and like delivering information in an entertaining way to where people can understand complex topics more easily. I leverage all the knowledge that I have in these other fields to make that happen, right? Which is different. And I'm trying to draw the distinction out between like the intellectual pursuit for itself and, what can you do with that intellectual pursuit? The reason being, I think that's the reason why ethics won. And I think there's a reason why ethics, if you take one philosophy class in in like a traditional college setting, it's going to be an ethics, or ethics is like one of the most common ones that's offered that you're supposed to take. And I think again, kind of makes sense if we think of ethics as that part of philosophy that tells you how you should be acting, right? But if you're gonna call yourself somebody who's interested in philosophy, you're supposed to be signaling that you understand those other fields exist, even if your specialty is in like ethics. So, you know, I think that's the interesting part of your question. I think if you ask that to any sample size, most people are going to say ethics because they kind of remember that word, right? And they have conversations at work about ethical behavior. But to elucidate the point, in case people aren't following, is like the reason for that is because like ethics always there's always multiple like ethics, and ethics are always mapped on top of a system or like a way of being or like a society, if you will. There's multiple ethical frames that can fit on top of like a society or a significantly dense and large enough population of people. Because there's always then like the system, and ethics is kind of like how you relate to the system and act within the system, right? If the system allows for 3 choices, but your ethical system only says one of those is right, well, then why is it that the system can allow for 3 ethical choices? You see, and that's again where, you know, like I've said it before, and I've made it very clear. Like, I'm not particularly interested in having Twitter spats. I'll do like entertaining stuff here and there, but if somebody wants to debate me on a philosophical idea, you know, then let's fine. But we have to have it in the medium where it's appropriate, and we have to make sure that we're having the conversation properly. And that's what gets lost in Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. That really covers most of the points I wanted to kind of like go over. Let's move into the next part of things. For where would you're a practicing skeptic, as you admit, you self-admit.
Sure.
Where would be a place? How do I put this? How would a libertarian listening to this who think, yeah, I don't know the basic presuppositions, or I don't know the philosophy things, like or they don't know any philosophical terms or jargon, what would you say is a place they could get started? Do you have any book ideas or any video or lecture series you could think of, or how would they begin to like orient themselves to properly think about and rectify the lack of philosophy in their political ideology?
This is some of the best advice that I was ever given. Good philosophy is about trying to change the way your brain works. So when you're really engaging with philosophy, again, I think there's a couple ways that people kind of engage with philosophy. One is to find and I'm not criticizing it, but I think there has to be a strong distinction made between them. One is to find their team, and that's a completely human thing to do. And by the way, I'm somebody who finds his own teams, as it were. But there's people who are looking at philosophy to find their team, right? These are the answers that I can use. I think part of that is because of how religious our age is, right? Where you would have turned to like a religious structure to answer these questions. A lot of people will turn to philosophies, and then there's people, like I said, that use philosophy as that tool of exploration, right? Your question, remind me of your question.
What's it people do? What's libertarians do who understand they have a problem with philosophy and rectify that?
But to the point is, when you're doing it right, and I would assume, I haven't taken like Liberty Classroom, but I like the people that Tom Woods has there, so that would probably be a good place to start.
I think it's pretty good.
But it's understanding that aspect of it. So while you can enter it with an ideological frame, and it's possible, and I certainly did, by the way, with that standard libertarian frame for a lot of the things that I read, you're not getting what you're supposed to get out of philosophy if you're not going that further step of, as the Aristotle quote that hangs up in my room here says, it is the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it. So that's that other part of philosophy where, now again, and part of that is where it comes, okay, so now we're going to have the exchange, and you're going to debate your precepts and I'm going to debate mine, right? So why do I say practicing skepticism? I say kind of for the same reason that people say they practice medicine, where it's like, it's not about having a completed set of ideas. For me, it comes from a radical position of doubt. And that in turn gives me a method to understand the world. So it's not about deconstructing things, right? It's about how can you put them back together. The skepticism is the deconstruction, but when you can put it back together, that's what I call sense making. In that I branding. There's a point I like in the chat. I like Hegelian dialectics to a limited degree. There's nothing. I think Hegel. I think the proper way to look at somebody like Hegel is like one of these people who has had profound influences on Western thought. And so you can't really escape Hegel. Just like as libertarians, you can't really escape liberalism. Now here's the thing, monarchists, the same thing goes for you guys, right? You guys can't, there's this like I said, there's like the people looking for their tribe, right? And so there's always the tendency to say like, oh, okay, cool, here, look, I found the thing. And you need people like that in a society, right? Otherwise things wouldn't get done.
Yeah.
But yeah, did I answer the question? That's it really starts for me. It has to start from a radical position of doubt and an openness of mind, and understanding that you're going to have to read through things that don't always make sense to you, and in fact you don't agree with, and you have to be able to actually put those arguments together.
This is actually a problem I've noticed, that a lot of libertarians don't read outside. If they read at all, a lot of them don't read outside of libertarianism. And they know they're going to already agree with it. So you rarely see someone read a book when they have to like draw out the arguments and say, why do I agree or disagree with this? They read books that already they know, okay, libertarian agree with this, I'm libertarian, I'm supposed to agree with this, so they read out. And there's nothing wrong with like reading more to strengthen your ideology and know more about your ideology. But I think there's a real lack of entertaining opposition in a libertarian's mind, in a libertarian framework.
Well, look, I'm not the mind. To some extent, I understand that as like economizing your time. Yeah. Why would I dedicate a lot of time to reading the other side? There's only a few people who really need to do that if you have a sufficiently broad enough movement. Would be my honest perception of that world. What the frustrating part is when somebody won't admit that. And because of for their ego or for their status or for whatever, for their own podcast feed, they go and they won't admit it.
Yeah.
And that's the part that can get frustrating. There's I've always experienced these people, and again, there's a higher concentration of them in libertarianism, you might say, but they exist elsewhere. But it's the people who try to logic you into things, and who view and the way my formulation is, they're people who view logic as an end and not the means. And that's a philosophical distinction right there, if there ever was one, when you're dealing with what is logic your ends or logic your means. And there's a lot of people that think, and there are reasons for this we can get into, and those reasons including schools of thought that were very, very popular throughout human history that held precisely that if you postulate the most rational argument for something, it must have some correspondence to truth, right? But so there is the belief that just because there is a logic to libertarian arguments, therefore libertarianism must be completely true, and therefore if I can get you to accept logic, then you must accept libertarianism. And it's like, no, you missed there's going back to the point you said before, because economics relies on presuppositions, as the top players in the field will lay out in detail whenever they do the theorizing of their field. Because it relies on those presuppositions, you can again get on faulty footing when you try to maximize that across the philosophical range.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see here. Now, on your point about like you really only need a few people in a movement to read outside the movement to engage with the other ideas. And it is a frustration where. Remember, I remember who I was talking to. I was talking to somebody how I read George Will's Statecraft is Soulcraft. And I despise George Will. Like, I absolutely cannot stand the guy. And there are people who are like critics who I was talking to, like, why does he waste time reading a 200-page book that has nothing in there what's valuable? Like, well, at least I want to know what the opposition thinks of the state, thinks of libertarianism. Like, there's value to be had. And it was like, I wasn't telling everybody to go read it. I was just using it to make a point, like a reference. And it was this weird opposition to even like using an outside ideology's point about anything. Like, it's I don't know what it is exactly like it causes it, but it's a how do I put it? It's a weird.
It's a pretty standard sociology. Okay, so it's like it's in groups and out groups. It's when you're talking about any kind of like subculture, it's always about in groups and out groups. And for people who read, part of that in group is what kind of books you're reading, right? Like, if you start talking to somebody, like oh, hey, I like to read. Oh, me too. What do you like to read? And she says she likes to read fiction, and you say you like to read nonfiction, but how you always think about you want to read fiction more, but really you just end up watching TV, and and then you, I don't know, hopefully grab drinks after that exchange. But like, to the point is the point is like, if people go outside the reservation for information, that's a problem. If too many people are doing that, then like that could be a problem, because what are you learning that I'm not? And also when a subculture prides itself on like being having like access to secret knowledge, I've called this thing like the secret knowledge fallacy. And it's something like, and the formulation is something like, if only the rest of the world knew what I knew, the world would be a better place. So says my secret knowledge. It's
literally just a weed wasp bar t-shirts.
Yeah, right.
That's it.
And again, and I think here's the rub. Here's where they're right. For a lot of people, a rational argument is enough to convince them of a particular way of thinking. But that's not all people. And this is, again, where I kind of started, I mentioned a while ago in the conversation, but this idea that I have of your temperament manifesting through behavior, and politics is just one of the ways in which that manifests, I guess, the most in our modern day, because of democracy, because of the height, because of the level of technology that we have. The fact that we can even have a conversation like this kind of requires that, that we're going to have a more that's basically what we've discovered, right? Is that because of the rate of technological exchange, politics has become more polarized, and people have, niched out, as it were.
Yeah.
But I think, again, to the point, there's no shame in not knowing something, except in a subculture which prides itself on knowing things, right? So and again, we're all creatures of ego, and we're all creatures who want to like defend what little we have.
Yeah.
And so where our human frustrations enter in is largely, I have found, when it comes to when people don't recognize that influence, and it's one thing. And when I was younger, when people would make fun of me and say that I tried to use words to sound smart, I would just kind of like, I was confused. And then after it happened enough times, you kind of start to realize that, I think you have to like recalibrate how you interact with the world if stuff like that happens consistently enough. Yeah. But to the point is, it's a very funny thing when people throw that out to me as an insult, and it's always a very common one. It's like, oh, you use big words to sound smart. And the sad truth is that I wasn't trying to use big words. It's literally something that I struggle with when I write.
Yeah, I've had it happen before where I normally just say, because I'm smarter than you.
Sorry, that was like, so I have to be self-aware, but that was like such a douchey podcaster diatribe that I just went on.
Yeah, it's fine. This is a niche podcast with 4 people watching on a Sunday night. It's going to be the most podcasty podcast,
It's fair.
That's the go. I want to have a podcast with 3 guys in tank top just complaining about women at a shopping center. That's what I was going to do.
Going back, I've said it, Ace. Let's how about have Caleb host the debate, man? Let's do it.
I'm willing to do it.
Let's find a fun topic. I'm
I
down
like
to have
both
it.
of you
I actually love debate. You know, that's the funny part is I like there's this part of you know, like I will continue to criticize Twitter debate, especially when people don't use it in the right frame. And if you're not using it like WWE, you're not using it in the right frame. If you legitimately, and I say this is a recovering Facebook addict, is like, you know, and truthfully, I've like come to like think Facebook in particular is so pernicious because people can write for as long as they want. And if you are, again, if we're talking about the subculture of libertarianism, like, you're talking about people of like a certain verbal acuity, because to gain interest in the ideas, for the most part, you have to be like, you have to have some grasp, you know what I mean? And just the fact of the matter is, especially in the written word, especially when you can write for a long periods of time or short periods of time on Twitter, if you're smart enough, you can always twist things well enough to keep suiting your side. That's why, again, logic is the means, not the end. And so people who treat logic as an end think that tool that what they're doing is like asserting their moral correctness on a situation, when in reality they're just deploying a rhetorical trick. Which is why personally I think debate is best held in a moderated environment where, you know, where at least somebody can say, okay, it's done. You know, and
my favorite kind of debates are ones like the I think sort of Oxford side debate. Maybe it's Oxford side debate. Is that what there's one where there's a voting thing at the end of it, and then there's one where it's like each side gets 15 minutes and 10-minute rebuttals, and they move on, and they have a cross-examination period. I think those are the styles I prefer. My problem is like I love Twitter debate because I like to have the time to think ahead of what I'm going to say. I'm not super quick on my feet, and so I don't like normally face to face or that like free flow debates. If it's structured, I can do pretty well. But hey, you and Ace both have Substacks. You know, maybe you guys can do a Substack debate. You know, each write these giant long letters to each other. They're just giant debates, but.
Be honest, I don't care that much. I mean, it's fun to do. It's fun from a content standpoint, and I like to poke fun at, and you know, like that's part of this podcasting thing is you poke fun at people. I've never met the man. I'm sure I've heard nice things about him. And for me again, it's the intellectual pursuit. So like for the sake of it, I'll have the debate for certain for a topic that I feel like I could properly defend. Right. Anyway, that's just having fun.
Absolutely.
But I do think if I'm speaking in all honesty, I do think that style of Twitter engagement that he engages in is honestly, it hurts. It hurts more than it helps. That's just my honest opinion. Just kind of from my interactions with it. Also seeing friends of mine interact with it, and it's kind of like this thing of like, oh, well, we can always go and I don't know. I try to focus in the building and the solution in the solution oriented space. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see me on Twitter too much. Every once in a while I'll get like a lazy day where I'm not super busy and I can poke some fun at stuff. But that's again, I think Twitter as WWE is the best frame, the best lens for you to use it in a healthy way.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise you're gonna spin out of control.
Yeah, the person who uses Twitter correctly is I think his name on Twitter is Jake_Q. That guy uses it correctly.
You know what? I'm gonna have to caveat because especially in the political space, because if again, if you're like a creator and you're putting out and you're like doing the information thing and you do graphs and charts, like that's all cool too. But if you're doing the commentary thing, it's you have to have that WWE sort of thing. And that's again, like, that's why I put out clips and stuff like that.
Well, we've gone we have a bit more time. Let's go back 15 more minutes. I would say that I think libertarians really, a good place to start for a lot of libertarians, I think, when they want to understand philosophy. I would say David Gordon has a lot of great stuff, specifically on history of economic thought. I think like studying a history of thought is a good, it's my view, a good introduction to a lot of different ideas. And it does a good job of laying out, like, okay, this guy thinks this way, this guy thinks this way. I could then use what I agrees or disagrees and figure out where to go more from there. So Rothbard's History of Economic Thought is a good book to kind of at least understand the foundations of Austrian economics and other schools of economic thought, and then really a lot of the lot of these people aren't economists, they're philosophers who had economic thinking. So I think that's a good place to start. But
yeah, and or like pick up Plato and read those. I can't
recommend Plato enough. I love Plato,
and it's kind of like for the same reason that you should read the Bible, is you should understand what's kind of at the beginning for the culture and society of today you live in. I think that's the other thing, because we've talked about how economics is a very modern science, right? Nobody would disagree with that assertion, even though praxeology per se has always existed, because there's always been a certain logic to human behavior, in that's been codified in the praxeology, is very modern. And I think that is the true benefit of a decent philosophical education, is to give you a sense of the scope of humans trying to sort out questions and trying to figure things out. And I think I've even talked about on your stream before about like the pre-Socratics. So like even before Socrates, even before this guy that we all kind of say he's the one who started something, there were people still trying to figure these puzzles out. Like I was reading the introduction to version of Euclid, and they were kind of like talking about the world, and it was like, and they were talking about geometry the way we might talk about a clip from Timcast or from the Joe Rogan Experience. It's like, did you see so and so's proof? And it's kind of like, and I was like struck by this vision of like a society where like the people in the know, they were all debating geometric proofs. And when you realize that people like that lived over 2,000 years ago, at this point, you start to, again, for me, it's like this rich, fulfilling tradition of humanity to realize it goes back so far. Yeah. And of course, so you can tie, I think, a lot of that modern, that conceit, if you will, on Enlightenment modernism, and certainly the postmodern age as well.
Yeah.
Of the idea of that there being knowledge ancient, that basically just the idea that the new knowledge supplants the old knowledge, and we don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, no,
and to the degree that the libertarian believes that, it's kind of just being also a victim of the age.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot, I think, specifically why someone who's getting more and more into like, scholastic philosophy or Greek philosophy, kind of going more into like that area. There's a lot of people who, I don't blame them for not liking philosophy, because when they think philosophy, they think of Descartes, the dualism, I'm thinking, the Cartesian dualism, or they think of like, I'm just a mind of vow. That's dumb. Like it's that bell curve meme, where it's like the 80 IQ, reality exists. Descartes in the middle, like it could be a demon like projecting false reality, and then the 180 IQ, and it's like, no, reality exists. And it's I don't blame people for having this rejection of everything after the Enlightenment philosophy. I don't blame them for wanting to think philosophy is all this that, but in the same way that after the Reformation happened, the founding reformers kind of outlawed a lot of the Greek and Catholic metaphysics and philosophy. That had such a major impact that still kind of existing today, even though the knowledge is out there and accessible. It's still just like, it's not like, who came up with there's some it was Roderick Long, the libertarian guy. He was doing a history of like philosophy stuff, and he went from Plato, Aristotle to Kant. And that was like the order of events. And I'm like, okay, you're gonna skip, huge. It's big names, but I think to kind of glance over the entire medieval period is a mistake.
Well, right. Well, there's but there's the reason for that, right? And there's historic, and this is, but again, to the point. So this supposedly noble field of study is still subject to the same political pressures that any other field is subject to. And that's, I think, and in fact, I talked about the difference between a more like I use the term generalist because I have a penchant for being disparaging to myself. But but the idea of generalism or the synthesis of information versus the again, that breaking the current university model, which is like the super niched out interest to where if I'm going to go and be an academic, that means I'm going to have a particular niche that I write in, and I contribute to this particular field, and I don't make major contributions to popular culture because I don't consider popular culture important. For fields like physics, that makes a lot of sense. For fields that deal with society, I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And this is again to the point of what's interesting is you actually see that desire for synthesis in the scholastics and in the intellectual culture of the medieval times and what is called today the Dark Ages. So it's interesting how and there's a need for both, I suppose. But I think well, in that I've tried to make it catchy, I think that theirs was an age of fission, right? If we think about the 20th century, and I think ours is an age of fusion. And I think that's one of the reasons why philosophy has actually become more important, right? That's why Jordan Peterson happened. Why he was able to kind of engage with things in a philosophical way, but also in a popular way that a lot of people could interact with.
Yeah.
And again, for me, just to be clear, for me, that's the part that I find interesting, is how you can get more people to pay attention to philosophical ideas. And it's something that I try to do. It's something that I try to do in my show. And I try to leverage those insights where they're applicable and use that to analyze the media and analyze power structures and use the skeptical method as a means of anti-formalism. Going back to the point of it's just a question of radical doubt. A skeptical person, as you'll find if you listen to my show, is I can have very strong beliefs about things. I just always maintain the position that I could be proven wrong about something, and so I take in evidence and reason, and it also means that things can change too, because there's multiple levels, right? You might have a tactical level, a strategic level, and then or what is it? The point being, you can have that grand overarching narrative. Then you have more proximate. You have your ultimate explanation for things, and you have your proximate explanation for things.
Yeah.
And
it's a great show. I've incorporated my daily my news shows for the week. Your show and Matt Walsh are my news shows I watch for current events.
Thank you.
So I'm definitely enjoying it.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate that.
Well, we've gone for 55 minutes. I really only have one more point. There seems to be with a lot of libertarians. Again, this is just me pretty much. This is my libertarian complaint episode, pretty much. There's been a lot of things I'm noticing over the past.
Tell me your troubles, son. I'll tell you why. I guess I should have had a pipe or something for this.
It's someone who's getting more and more into philosophy, more and more outside strictly libertarian circles. I'm noticing a lot of things. I'm like, okay, I need to at least, for my own comfort, call this out at least once, so that if anyone might point to it again, someone says, "Well, where did this come from?" I have an episode complaining about this in the past, so go watch that. There seems to be this how do I put this? With some specifically left libertarians or more mainstream libertarians or regime libertarians, as Lou Walker will call them, they have no real art statements, or we're kind of more relativist, where it's I just want these gay people to protect marijuana farms with the AR-15s. And then when you say, well, I don't think, you say anything un-PC, and immediately you're a damnable person everyone to ignore. They have this very how to put it, libertarians, you would think, would have strict moral standards for, okay, we need people to act in these ways that will ensure a liberty-free society. But they are very hesitant to call out anything as actually being immoral or moral, because their legal framework becomes their whole ideology. Do you have any comments on that kind of observation?
I think that the modern libertarian movement was a pretty interesting experiment. And it was a pretty interesting experiment. And well, it was an experiment for multiple reasons. Primary among them, think of the last 50 years with the modern Libertarian Party. Okay, so it was this experiment of saying, let's have an ideologically committed political party. Forget about the fact that it's a third runner in a two-man race. We want an ideologically committed party. And so the idea was, if we have a political party set around ideology, that would actually be better, because then people from across the country, because prior to that, in modern politics, you have to understand this historical point. Most politics was geographical, right? It's like for basically up and through the New Deal and through the 60s and so on. Most politics was geographical. That's why you would have your left wing Republicans and your right wing Democrats, right? Your Dixiecrats or whatever. They're different ones that were used used as examples. And so then you have the Libertarian Party said, okay, well let's bind people around ideology. And so it's like, oh, okay, cool. That kind of sounds like it'll work. Well, turns out when you bind people around ideology, specifically these libertarian ideas, you actually bind people who are interested in the ideas for completely different reasons. That doesn't become a problem until, 14 years into the 21st century, when there's this thing called social media that we realize can have massive influence across the population. And in fact, we've realized that we can manipulate people's temperament, their behavior, based off of like assumptions. And in particular, as it relates to politics, we can do this. We can manipulate their behavior. So now we have political parties that are far more a reflection of people's behavior. And yes, to a large degree, geography, but there are certain behavioral and cultural attitudes that go with being a Republican today that didn't 20 years, that weren't certainly 50 years ago, right? Again, if we're talking about this libertarian experiment. And so I think what you ended up seeing was that libertarianism brought together disparate personalities that, based off the pressure points that the current authority structures want to hit, actually divide people in half multiple times. And that's where you see the split on things like, and so again, your temperament manifested through your behavior. That's why we see the split on things like abortion and on things like immigration and on things like gun control. And when I would classify all those as part of the cult of American democracy. And because, again, behavior manifesting, your temperament manifesting through your behavior, right? It's not the case that the average person in a democracy thinks, oh, well, once we let in 30% if we have a 30% immigration rate with a 6% mortality rate and a 3% birth rate and blah, 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 blah. No, that's not how most people interact with the idea of immigration. Most people interact with the idea either, if you're a more conservative person, right? If you're a more conservative person, if you have a stricter idea of what hierarchy is, if you understand that borders are important, and in fact in your own everyday life, borders are really, really important for you, right? Like, you have a job that you do well and you do it the same way every single day, and you wake up in the morning and you probably have the same routine because these borders are essential for your existence. You say, and you're like, well, hang on. We have a legal immigration system, so why are people allowed to come here illegally? That's wrong. That's unfair. And then the other side of that is somebody who is, let's say, very, very high in openness, right? And that person who's very, very high in openness sees a child and says, that child is my child. That child could be my child, but for the grace of God go I, right? It could have been if it's the toss of the die that means I was born in America and this person wasn't. Who am I to exclude them from my country? So you see a completely rational and coherent standpoint that exists at the core here. But then the political game that's being played, because much of what we consider politics is really just like a propaganda war, and trying to control certain degrees of certain amounts of the population. But so since most of what we're seeing is actually a propaganda war, it's actually about stoking those tension points where, again, we can rationalize coherent arguments on both sides. Well, then we turn those things into something like open or closed borders. And there are these like strict, rigid definitions of what these things mean. And so now I'm stuck in a debate about open and closed borders when, like, clearly the analogy to use is a semi-permeable membrane. Well, why don't we get to that point? We don't get to that point because of the incentive structure of most political debate, including libertarian political debate, because it kind of borrows from that same democratic tradition. It kind of has to, you know, because again, we're all victims of the age we're raised in.
No, I excuse me. I 100% agree. Like I made a post a while ago about how because we're all born in a liberal society, we're all kind of like suffer from what James Burnham called the liberal syndrome. Like we all kind of have that, and just intrinsically, because like, you're inundated with it from the moment you're born with your society and culture. You're gonna have these things that you have to be acknowledged, at least I gave an example. Like I was thinking of something. Like, why does this make me feel guilty? Well, it's not that it actually is wrong. It's that society has conditioned me to believe that that is a wrong, and there's a distinction there. But we've gone for an hour.
And I was gonna say, and the process of philosophy is meeting out whether or not it is society telling us something, or perhaps whether it is actually the good in itself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, we've gone for an hour and 2 minutes. Do you have any final thoughts before you give your plugs? Any final thoughts on the conversation?
Oh, only that. No, I mean, I think we covered it well. You know, I think I like people to play more with this idea of, you know, behavior your temperament manifesting through your behavior. It's a really useful lens when you start to put things through that, especially when you analyze the political arguments. When you realize that when you're having a political disagreement, again, this is better advice for your friends and family than it is for a stranger on the internet. But just, you know, recognize that. And some people really do see things from a different perspective, and that's why we need things like philosophy and economics to help formalize knowledge, so that we can activate things at a cultural level. And in summation, that cultural level also has a biological input, and it's all connected, and everything is really, really cool, man. So, you know, fun times.
Absolutely. Well, go ahead and give your plugs.
If you like anything that I've had to say today, please go to beenawake.com, subscribe with your email address. I release videos, clips, full podcasts, original writing, and plenty more in due time. Go there, subscribe, get a 2-week trial. Take a look at some of the stuff that I put out behind the paywall. I try to put some things out, but really just if you throw me a few bones, it shows me that I'm doing something worthwhile, and it helps me dedicate more time to it in my daily life.
Awesome.
Oh, and follow me on all social media at the L.B. Muñiz.
Got it. Well, excuse me. Sorry. Well, that's another episode of Faith, Liberty, and Practice. This is season 2, episode 8. Based on what we just talked about, go read some Plato. Specifically, I would say the 5 dialogues. Would you agree that would be a place to start with Plato?
Oh, I mean that tends to be the place to start. Either that or the Republic. I mean, if you want specifically just the political nuts, I would say go with that. And then, you know, like look for people who have lectures on stuff as well.
Absolutely. If you want an overall view of philosophy, I would say The Cave in the Light by, oh my God, what's his name? Arthur Herman. Cave in the Light. History of Plato opposed to Aristotle through Western history. Really good book. Like, I cannot recommend that book enough to people. And for all the libertarians who's like, well, why should I read that book? Well, he's from this Michael Marath and went on the show a couple of times. So you have an out. You have an excuse.
There you go. He's in the end group.
He's in the end group. You're allowed to read this guy. So there we go. But yeah, anyway, go read Plato. Have a good night.